Do you ever lead anyone virtually? How about have any colleagues that you don't see regularly but interact with online? Maybe even a family member? In today's show, we'll look at some best practices for leading and influencing virtually. This is Coaching for Leaders, episode number 87.
Produced by Innovate Learning, maximizing human potential.
Greetings to you from Orange County, California. This is Coaching for Leaders, and I'm your host, Dave Stachowiak. This is a weekly show to help smart people improve their communication and leadership skills. And one of the things I'm always doing with our community is having conversations about what's going on in the world and how can we be more effective as leaders and improve our communication and leadership skills. And one thing that's been in the media a lot over the last month or so is the decision by Yahoo to no longer allow employees to telecommute. And this got me thinking about how leadership has changed in some ways, and of course in some ways not changed, on how we're all leading virtually and some of the positives and negatives about that, and got into conversation with a few people in our community and ended up talking with one person in particular and thought it would be interesting to approach this topic in a show and talk about leading virtually and maybe some best practices for doing it. And many of us are, even if we're not working in a virtual environment or working from home, many of us are leading and influencing people that are in other locations or that do work from home. And even if we're not managing them formally, we are all influencing people all the time. I look back on my week and I think about all the different time zones I talked to people in the last week. And I think I added up like 6 or 7 time zones. But that's a typical week now. And I think it's a typical week for many of you as well. And so I'm really pleased to welcome Loren Kousaie on the show today. He is from Microsoft, has a lot of experience leading people virtually. I think you'll find his thoughts really valuable. So here's my interview with Loren Kousaie. I am thrilled to welcome as my guest this week, Loren Kousaie. Loren is the head of worldwide commercial customer service for Microsoft, and he is joining me today to speak about the topic of virtual leadership, how to lead people when you're not physically in the same place. And Loren and I got connected from one of our community members and longtime listeners, Duke Whitman, who also is at Microsoft. And Duke and I were actually talking about the recent decision by Yahoo to not do virtual work anymore for their employees. And we were going back and forth and kind of talking about that decision and talking about just that skill and that competency that leaders need to have these days. And in that conversation, Duke said, who would be great to talk to is Loren. Loren has been doing this for a long time, knows a lot about virtual leadership and management of teams, and would provide some wonderful perspective. And so, Loren, I am so thrilled to welcome you to the show. Welcome to Coaching for Leaders.
Well, thanks very much, Dave. I appreciate the opportunity to talk and looking forward to it.
Oh, me too. Before we get started and talk a little bit about virtual leadership, tell me about your role at Microsoft and just kind of how you're physically spaced from your team so we can get a thumbnail sketch of how your organization's set up.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned at the intro, I'm currently leading the customer service group for our commercial business support organization over at Microsoft. And so, almost just by nature of the fact that I am in sort of a global role, I'm providing leadership not only over a team of delivery managers who oversee a number of our call centers across North America, but I also have kind of a virtual leadership role over similar functions around the world in regions, all around the world, Latin America, Europe, Asia, and Japan as well.
Wow.
So, the nature of my role, just by the fact that it's global, has a certain degree of remote leadership tied to it. That's sort of, I guess, compounded by the fact that I'm actually based in Toronto, Canada, even though most of my direct reports are scattered across the U.S. and other parts. And so that sort of leads to kind of a dual leadership where I'm not only a virtual leader for sort of a worldwide community, but even my own direct reports are scattered across the U.S. as well.
One of the things that I've noticed just in my work in especially the last year or so, Loren, is even though I most of the people I'm leading are in the States here. How much, things really do vary day by day as far as time zones, connecting with people. So I'm wondering if you could share with us just what's a typical day like for you, and what kind of tools are you using to stay connected with your team, and what does that look like in practice on a daily basis?
Well, certainly, as you can probably imagine, in our business, there really isn't such a thing as a typical day. But I think if I kind of think about the sort of elements of virtual leadership that occur sort of typically throughout the course of my work, there's obviously sort of very day-to-day interactions that happen, with the stakeholders that I work with right around the world. That may involve sort of regularly scheduled meetings that often involves sort of dealing with more urgent things that sort of pop up at any time. All of that type of stuff is naturally, we don't have a lot of option to deal in any other way other than remote contact. And so, we use our technology, extensively. So from my end, and as a Microsoft employee, we're very plugged into a tool called Link, which Link is actually what you and I are speaking through right now.
It is.
That's basically the communications tool that we use both for voice communications as well as we can do video just as easily. And so a lot of our communications, a lot of our sort of all of interactions that I have with the folks I work with are through that tool. I mean, there's obviously your emails and other sort of standard vehicles for kind of keeping connected. But I think this Link tool is probably sort of the primary one for us to keep the people across the organization connected at all times.
I know I'm
not sure if that's totally answering the entire question of what a typical day is, but hopefully gives a sense of the bustle of it and the international flavor that again the communication tools we use allows us to keep all connected.
Yeah, and I think the only other question that brings up for me, Loren, is how you manage like time zones and interacting with people who are on very different schedules. Is that something that you find that you will sometimes be doing things like late in the evening or early in the morning, or do other folks adapt to you, or do you kind of see how it goes with each individual person?
Of course. Well, what I found a couple of things. Although I'm based in Toronto, what I have found is that in order to make my daily work work with my management team and with my direct reports, I've effectively adopted my own schedule to Pacific time, where the rest of the business is sort of centered. And so
interesting.
I do find I tend to start my day maybe a little bit later than many of my colleagues here in Toronto, but then I'll end the day also very late. So I'll sort of have maybe a 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. kind of schedule rather than sort of an 8 to 5 or something like others out here would have. Obviously, though, in an environment where you're working with a lot of contacts in the regions around the world, you do also have to find a way to stay connected, with people who may be a full 12 hours away from you. So we've set up a rhythm of different types of calls. So when we do our international calls, we'll kind of alternate between doing them very, very early in the morning and subsequently doing them very, very late in the evening. And in that way, we end up accommodating all of the regions without, putting anyone out repeatedly month over month, if that makes sense. So we kind of say, our monthly reviews will, be morning ones for this month and evening ones for next month. And in that way, everyone, whatever, suffers equally, which I suppose is
right, exactly.
is the best way to do it.
So you've been doing this for a bit at leading virtual teams. What's different about leading people working virtually than leading in other venues?
Well, I think probably the most obvious component is just, you don't tend to have the physical presence. One of the nice things about being in a room full of people is you're visible and you can show body language and you can, make your point, you can be directive and visible in the things that you're doing and saying. Now, as soon as you're remote, I mean, even if you do have video going, you still kind of lose that sense of physical presence. Mm-hmm. And what it's kind of forced on me, and I think it's maybe just something that we all sort of adapt to, is, a good part of your leadership in the course of leading a meeting or leading people through discussions is, there's a component of just, you're exercising leadership through the tone of your voice and through the way that you carry yourself vocally. So that's probably sort of the most obvious difference. I think what it's also led to, though, for me is I try to do as much of the leading as I can outside of the actual meetings themselves, if that makes sense. I think it's very important for any remote leader to, do what they can to build the right connections with the key stakeholders that they work with or will be working with kind of before those events happen. It's a lot easier to sort of exercise leadership and build confidence and respect amongst the people you work with if they kind of know you before that moment where you're whatever, leading them through something. And so for me, a big part of, I think, my success in this role has been about, building those remote relationships so that leadership becomes less about how you conduct yourself in those, specific meetings or those specific events that are maybe a little bit more spread out in time.
It's interesting to hear you say that because I've definitely noticed that pattern with people I've worked with and clients who've been pretty successful at being able to navigate politics of organizations is that there seems to be a general consensus that a lot of decisions and a lot of leadership doesn't necessarily happen at the meeting. It happens before the meeting or after the meeting. And that it's interesting that you're sort of, you've had that experience as well of really taking the time to build those connections before meetings and before major decisions in order to get engagement with people.
It's interesting, in some respects, perhaps being a remote employee and a remote leader almost forces you to learn that in ways that perhaps you don't, you don't have the opportunity to experience the need for that as much when you are present. So there may be some, peripheral benefits of being remote like this that come out.
Yeah. So this leads to my next question, which is how do you set expectations with your team about what a remote relationship will be like with you?
That was an interesting question. I kind of felt when you'd mentioned this question would be coming up earlier, I found myself lost thinking, boy, that's an obvious one, and I don't really have a good answer. And I guess I realized as I thought about this that I really don't explicitly sort of set out some rules up front of here's how it's going to be to work with me and what our remote relationship is going to be like. I think in some ways a successful relationship or a successful remote relationship is probably one that you don't really even notice as being a remote one. And so, in some ways, I guess my goal is just to be and feel very present with the people that I'm working with, at all times. And again, sort of getting back to, it's a lot more than just, the individual meetings that you might have with people, but making a point of, even when you don't have meetings with them, to try to be a little bit present, to use Link to, say hello and check in with people periodically and so on. If you sort of exercise that kind of conscious effort to be present throughout the course of working, I don't know that there's really a need to sort of say here's the way it's going to be and here's how we're going to work together over the course of this remote relationship. I think I do have a few, I guess, little principles or practices that I've tended to apply as a result of sort of, going through some learnings in this experience. So a basic one is that I do make a point of having at least a formal one-on-one meeting every single week with my employees and key stakeholders. So, in previous roles, particularly in the on-premise relationship, if you like, you could go for 2 weeks or even a month without having, a lot of regular formal dialogue with your manager.
Sure.
And what I found is in this environment that can very quickly create a sense of distance. So even though I do sort of consciously make regular efforts every single day to reach out to key stakeholders and employees and so on, I also do have at least one sort of formal discussion with all of them a week. It may not be a long one, but just something that's in the calendar that ensures we do stay connected on the things that we're each doing and working on and our priorities and so on. Because it is, I think, easy to lose sight of one another if you don't do that. So, I guess I've got a few, I don't know if you call those ground rules, but they're nothing I'm sort of explicit about. It's just something I apply and no one's argued about it, so I keep doing it.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, Loren, because I've noticed with my work at Dale Carnegie that, we've done some virtual leadership over the last year or so, and there's definitely people that I don't connect with as much just because I don't see them. And if I don't make that effort, we can go 3, 4, 5 weeks sometimes without making that connection if we're not actively working on something. So it is really easy to fall into that trap if you're not being intentional about that, isn't it?
Absolutely. And over time, you suddenly realize you really are disconnected. And I think, if I go back to sort of early learnings from when I first was being remotely managed, that's almost 10 years ago now, that was one of my biggest learnings at that time was by by not making conscious efforts to stay connected with who was my sort of remote manager at the time. A month would go by and I would realize, boy, that manager had no idea what I had been up to over the last month, and I had no ideas of what that manager might be expecting from me, and created a very, I don't know, not a very, fast-paced, productive, successful relationship. Not that any bad things happen, but it's hard to really drive a business forward when you're not deeply connected. And so over time, I just learned that you really do need to find ways to stay connected, no matter what. And that it's important to, I think, have a few little rules like that, just to make sure that, even in times when you're really busy, you're still going to stay connected with those important stakeholders on a very regular basis.
Yeah, it sounds like a really important mind shift that you made when you got into the position of leading virtually. I'm curious also what other mind shifts you may have made when you began to lead virtually a lot, or maybe even when you were led virtually, of things that were changes that were helpful for you.
Yeah. And actually, so as I mentioned, I've been, I think, remotely managed now for something close to 10 years now. It, again, partly as a result of just the role I'm in and the size of the company that I work for, the opportunity, the likelihood that you may be managed by someone who's not in the same building as you grows steadily and is certainly there. And early on, I did find it difficult. I found that I felt a bit like an island every day, coming to work and doing my thing, and again, not necessarily finding the good opportunities to really keep my manager connected on what I was working on and where I thought we should go as a business, and probably through that undermining my own effectiveness, because my own vision for where we might be never really surfaced a whole lot. So I guess the biggest mind shift that's sort of happened to me, or that I've kind of adopted since that time, is really the realization that both being managed and managing from a remote setup requires a certain kind of effort. You do have to do it consciously. You can't just kind of hope it works out and just sort of work the way you might have always worked in a sort of on-premise or whatever, in a face-to-face environment. You do have to consciously make those little steps to be visible and present. And you do need to make those, schedule those regular meetings with people that you won't otherwise see or be able to speak to as regularly. I think you probably also have to set some rules for yourself that, to recognize that, in some ways, I think it isn't a disadvantage to be remote. You can kind of decide that it is a disadvantage, and once you've decided that it's a disadvantage to be remote, you'll all of a sudden maybe be a little bit apologetic if you try to speak up during a meeting, or be afraid to disrupt the flow of the conversation. And I think in some ways, if you just choose to decide that it's not a disadvantage and that you're not going to apologize for being vocal, and kind of recognize that you're involved for a reason, and your contribution is kind of expected. And in some ways, you just have to therefore sort of make a conscious decision that you will be present and active and engaged in all conversations, rather than becoming that kind of silent person on the speakerphone, which I think you could very easily become if you're not sort of being conscious about the experience and the approach you want to take as a remote employee.
Yeah, and it's actually...
Does that all make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And I was thinking, what great advice for people working in the same physical location too. And I think it's interesting because sometimes people sort of, if they're not being intentional about it, they slide by in a physical environment if they aren't as engaged or as present. But it's a little harder to do that virtually. I mean, you really do have to make that an intentional part of your day. But gosh, so important for people in a physical environment too, to really contribute and to stay connected. And it's one thing to be physically in the room. It's another thing to be really present.
Absolutely. That's a very good point. And once again, maybe just another piece of evidence that there really isn't that much difference between, managing remotely and managing in, whatever on premise. It's really just a conscious decision that you make yourself either way.
Yeah. What would you like to have known about moving into a virtual environment that you didn't necessarily know when you started doing this a lot?
I think in some ways we've touched on that one already. I think the main point for me really is I it never occurred to me early on that this environment was going to require any different effort from what I'd done previously. And so, early on, I just sort of took the same approach that I had taken when working with, people sort of internally. And I think in becoming remote, like I said, I did sort of realize it did require some effort, and you had to be very conscious about making yourself visible and present and engaged, so that you didn't sort of slide into the background. That's something that might have been useful to know early on, that I just, over time you start realizing in order to be effective, you're going to have to, make a conscious effort. And that's I think probably the biggest takeaway. I'm sure there are others, but that was certainly the main one I give to others when they're first moving into a remote environment, is to, make sure that you're conscious about how you're going to conduct yourself.
That's great advice, and that's something I'm already thinking about. Some things I'll structure my day with differently based on what you've been saying and how I'm leading people virtually too. So, Loren, one of the things that I find is under a conversation that doesn't happen very much in leadership or among leaders is that leadership can be pretty lonely. And I would imagine, and having done more of it in the last year or two, leading virtually can be even lonelier sometimes. So what do you do to stay in community with others, both professionally and personally, that keeps you well connected with the world and with your professional community?
That's a really interesting question. And to be honest, I have never felt lonely in my role.
Oh, yeah?
And I think it's probably because I do some of the things that I described earlier to maintain a sense of connectedness with the people that I work with every day. I mean, if, despite the fact that I'm 3,000 miles away from most of my employees, I think most of them would say, yeah, I think I speak to Loren probably every day at some point. And that's often just through the technology that I described earlier. But I think, that sense of loneliness usually comes from a sense of not being connected. And I think perhaps, as a remote worker who hasn't found the way to make sure they do stay connected with the people they sort of work and interact with every day, maybe you could get that feeling. And maybe that is, kind of subconsciously part of why I have made those very conscious efforts to, to not sort of disappear into the background and to be sort of a little bit invisible, because perhaps that would lead to a sense of isolation. But no, honestly, I think perhaps it's just me, but I really haven't found that this environment creates that for me. And again, perhaps that was a conscious decision I just didn't realize was a conscious one.
Okay, great. I'm going to hire you for some coaching then, because I think that's something I could improve upon.
Interesting. All right. Yeah. Well, what kind of rate are you paying?
Oh, yeah. We'll talk after. We'll talk offline later. Hey, Loren, you've had a really successful career. You work for an organization that just has a wonderful reputation and a great brand around the world. So you're doing a lot of things right in your role, and you've been doing it for a while. What's a discovery that you've made about yourself along the way that you feel that's contributed to your success?
This is one of the questions that stumped me earlier as I thought about it. I think in some ways, probably the answer to that one is a similar one to the question you asked earlier about, things I've learned or things, key takeaways. Mm-hmm. I think making the effort to build the relationships with the people with whom who are your stakeholders or who are involved in your life and the work that you do or impacted by it every day, is just such a valuable and critical component of being successful. I think if people don't really know you or don't have a trust in you or haven't built the right level of confidence in your abilities, it's hard to get things done. And I find, the way to get around that is to reach out and connect with people. And I think that's just as easy to do as an in the building employee as it is with a remote one. So you just use the technology differently, I think, but, or use technology versus, using your feet, I guess. But I think for me, that's been the biggest one, that if, if you know who are stakeholders in your work, get to know them and help them to know you, because that'll ultimately build the sort of confidence and relationships that you'll need to then be able to get things done and to be effective as a leader as you work with people down the road.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, hey, I really appreciate your time, Loren, and you taking a few minutes out of your day to connect with our audience. And I know that folks will gain a lot from your wisdom and your experience. And thanks for being a part of the show today.
No problem at all, Dave. Thanks very much for the opportunity, and great talking with you once again.
Loren Kousaie is the head of worldwide commercial customer service for Microsoft. Loren, have a great day.
Thanks again, Dave, and you too.
One thing I'm going to be doing after having this conversation with Loren is being more intentional about connecting with people that I interact with virtually every week. I keep in touch with people weekly, but I'm starting to think after talking to Loren, hey, maybe doing a little more often is probably better, even the people I don't necessarily lead formally. And so that's one thing that I'm doing coming out of this conversation. And you hopefully are doing something differently as well. And I'd love to hear what you took away and also what you'd like to add in, what's worked well for you as you've led virtually in the recent past and found things that have been effective. Join us on the conversation at coachingforleaders.com/87. That's a great way to connect with the dialogue about the show. You can also call me at 949-38-LEARN to leave a comment, question, or feedback. And a great way to reach me too is by email, and that is feedback@coachingforleaders.com. Hey, you may remember I recorded a show a couple weeks ago on how to pick yourself up when you're down. Hey, it was interesting. I had one of those weeks where I was doubting myself on a few different projects and interactions and with people. And you know how you have those weeks sometimes? You just don't feel like you're firing at all cylinders. I had one of those weeks. And I was going back at one point during the week and looking for something else. And I was looking and came across some old quotes that I had written down and recorded. And one of them was this little quote. I'm not sure if it's a quote or a poem from T.S. Eliot, who was one of my favorite poets. And I found this little tiny paragraph. I don't remember where I found it, but I thought it was helpful to me. I thought it might be helpful to you too. Here it is. In order to arrive at what you do not know, you must go by the way, which is the way of ignorance. In order to possess what you do not possess, you must go by the way of dispossession. In order to arrive at what you are not, you must go through the way in which you are not. And what you do not know is the only thing you know. And what you own is what you do not own. And where you are is where you are not. T.S. Eliot. Hey, thank you to Bill Crosby, Tom Otley, Rick Becerra, Adrana Clement, Ben Gariba, Sandra Perez, Miriam Sislasvili for following me this week on either Twitter, Facebook, or Google+. Hey, if you'd like to stay connected with me as well, simply go to coachingforleaders.com/Twitter/Facebook or /plus. That's a great way to stay connected. And hey, a very special thank you to David Solar. David, thank you for the kind review you left me on the iTunes platform. I so appreciate you taking the time to do that. Hey, if you've been listening to the show for a while and it's been helpful to you and you use iTunes, please go to coachingforleaders.com/iTunes, and I'd love to receive a written review from you as well. And thank you in advance if you choose to do that. It helps more people to find the show. Hey, if you would like a midweek booster shot, I send out an email article every week with a booster shot of good leadership communication skills. Just go to coachingforleaders.com/subscribe. It's free, and you'll hear from me in your email box pretty much every Wednesday. Hey, have a great week, everybody. Talk to you next week.